Eastern Europe is a vast territory of forest and plains, requiring much time and effort to traverse by foot. Yet, the Baltic, the Caspian and the Black Sea lie interconnected by a complex network of rivers. For thousands of years, the inhabitants of the riverbanks have traversed between north and south, east and west, exchanging fashion, ideas, and riches. During the early Middle Ages, it was Europe's most important trade network and dominated by seafaring Norsemen. Traveling in light but sophisticated ships, they rode and sailed as far as Greece and Persia. Along the rivers, markets and manufacturing sites grew into small settlements, looking to attend the needs of the travelers, and eventually housing a prosperous mid and upper class. These are places like the ones previously discussed, Daugava and Holmgard. What defines these places are their geographical significance. Daugava sat at the entrance of the southern trade route to Byzantium from Lake Ladoga. Holmgard guarded this route from an easily fortified hilltop. These geographical features allowed the local lords to tend to, trade with, and impose a toll on travelers. However, the rivers are not always connected directly. There was no straight passage from the Baltic to the south, the waterways broken up by tracts of land. It was no issue. In winter, travel could be conducted by sled on the snow, and in summer, the boats could be portaged. This is the act of transporting a seafaring vessel over a landmass, either physically carrying it or dragging it over a usually prepared pathway. These passages, also called portages, made a traveler susceptible to attack. They needed defense, a place to rest, and someone to maintain the portage. The most prominent portage on the eastern trade route is the one between the river Kasplia in the north and the great Dniepr in the south. The Kasplia is a tributary of the great Daugava, directly connected to the Baltic Sea. The Dniepr could be reached from the north by a portage from the Lovat, directly connected to Lake Ilmen and Ladoga. It is no surprise then that a settlement would appear on the portage between the Kasplia and the Dniepr, running along the banks of the latter. It is in fact the largest archaeological site discovered in the region and has proven a virtual treasure trove. It is comparable to more well-known locations like Novgorod or Kiev, and some have even argued that it was the most important settlement on the route to Byzantium. Nowadays it is called Gnezdovo. Back in the Viking Age it was considerably easier to defend yourself. Just build your house on a large hill and you're pretty much set. But with technology nowadays it's a bit more complicated. As an experiment, try googling your name and see what comes up, and whether you would like for this to be so easily available or not. This available information can be sold by data brokers to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. That is where the sponsor of today's video, Aura, comes in. This application is able to show you which data brokers are selling your private information and automatically submits requests to opt you out. This will reduce the amount of spam you receive, but also protects you from hackers who can use your info to access your social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. Recently there was a data breach from AT&T, leaking the private information of 73 million of their users out onto the dark web. AT&T recommends for those affected by the data breach to use strong passwords, monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. And yeah, no one has the time to do all of this, so Aura manages all of it for you in a neat, single package. I know that a lot of you guys are keyboard warriors with strong opinions, some of you probably even employed by secret service agencies. Using Aura will definitely assist in preventing you from any sudden mishaps. And if you're just an average Joe without unhealthy historical obsessions or fringe political views, then Aura is excellent for protecting your online identity. If you value your privacy, you can go to https://aura.com/Baltic to start your 2-week free trial. The link is also available in the video description and pinned comment below. But please, look up existing reviews and educate yourself on the service, so you know what to expect. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. Back to Gnezdovo. Named after a nearby village, the mysterious archaeological site is believed to have been the ancestor of the modern and medieval town of Smolensk. It is common for modern European cities to have previously been located elsewhere and, simply moved. This happened with the city of Novgorod. Gnezdovo was very likely called Smolensk back in the old days. The Norse seems to have called it Smaleskia. Others believed it was called Surnes, seemingly related to the river Svinets, meaning swine river. In Byzantine sources, it appears to have been called Milinska. Vital to understanding Gnezdovo is the geography, which is quite special compared to other settlements of the region and period, and it truly makes Gnezdovo a phenomenon unique to its time and circumstance. The archaeological site is absolutely massive, and encompasses a distance of between 6 kilometers and an area of about 30 hectares. Central to understanding the location is the great river Dniepr in the south, and its smaller, right bank tributaries. The longer, Olshankaya, and the shorter Svinets, located a few kilometers upstream from the Olshankaya. The video will focus on the area directly around the Svinets. The Svinets flows into the Dnieper, and on its left flood bank lies a lake called the Bezdonka. Further east and elevated above the Bezdonka lies the lake Kamishi. Nowadays the area is subject to dramatic flooding during springtime. You can see the topography of the peninsula on this map. The light blue color represents the lower grounds, annually subject to flooding. The green areas are sometimes subject to flooding, and the yellow and red ones are located high up and are pretty much safe. However, the flooding during the Viking Age would have been less dramatic if barely noticeable, since the local climate back then was more arid and the water content of the river lower. The soil itself was sandy and infertile, altogether unsuitable for agrarian settlements. This meant that the peninsula and floodplains of the Svinets were uninhabited for most of its history. The vicinity harbors few archaeological sites, indicating that it was sparsely inhabited and had no developed agricultural hinterland. Judging by the findings of long barrows, the original inhabitants were primarily Baltic. The Slavic Krivichi entered the area during the 9th century, erecting their signature grave mounds. They constructed small, isolated settlements, as can be seen on this map. These cemetaries usually consist of between 10 to 30 mounds, and none of the settlements are larger than 2 hectares in area. Findings indicate that there was little wealth in them and little to no social differentiation. They primarily sustained themselves on rye. It is not known when the Norsemen first took interest in the region. For most of the 8th century, their primary interest had been to the north, traveling from Lake Ladoga down to the Volga River into the Caspian Sea and Abbasid Caliphate. The primary import were Arabic silver coins. And trade had definitely occurred between the Baltic and Black Sea since the Bronze Age, but not on a large enough scale to warrant the existence of a trading post like Gnezdovo. 839 marks the first documented visit of Norsemen to Byzantium. They were Swedes who called themselves Rus. They wanted to travel home, but the way back was considered too dangerous. During the first third of the 9th century, the lower Dniepr was dominated by the warlike Magyars. Their raids reached as far as Francia and Moravia. This undoubtedly made the Rus cautious, but they still managed to muster an attack on Constantinople in 860, seemingly organized out of Lake Ilmen, which was most likely the site of the first capital of the Rus. Several changes in the turn of the 9th century would facilitate a rising interest in the route to Byzantium. In the final decades, there seems to have been a substantial decline in the flow of Arabic silver, the cause unknown. Trade with the Far East declined, and the Rus began to look southward, to Byzantium. To reach the Dnieper and the southern waterway, the Norsemen had 2 options. They could either cross the Baltic to Lake Ladoga, sail up the Volkhov River down to Lake Ilmen, then down the river Lovat and pulled over a lengthy portage to the river Daugava. The Daugava could alternatively be entered via the Baltic, at its mouth in modern-day Latvia. From Daugava, the boats had to be pulled over a lengthy portage to the banks of the Dnieper. The lengthy passage developed a need for a stopping point in which the travelers could rest, repair their boats and trade. This led to the founding of Gnezdovo around the turn of the 10th century. Let's take a look at how the settlement developed. Initially, the central settlement was quite small, about 4 hectares in area and without fortifications. The location might seem a bewildering pick for a trade post, it wasn't located on the most effective portage between the Dniepr and Daugava, which was up to 30 kilometers away. Travelers would either have to portage their boats over a longer distance to reach Gnezdovo, or they took the shorter route and then rowed upstream to reach the settlement. An arduous task, so reaching Gnezdovo must have been worth it. Central to Gnezdovo's prominence were the two lakes, the Bestonka and Kamichi. Evidence points to a canal having been dug between the Svinets and Bestonka, allowing travelers to enter a safe harbor within the lake. The harbor was further improved by several constructions. Archaeologists have found well-preserved pickets, secured with remnants of bast rope. These were most likely mooring pickets, to which the boats could be tied up and secured. This is one of the most rudimentary harbor constructions. On the northeastern bank, a trench was dug and panelled with thin wooden logs and perches. Presumably, this was a rudimentary sort of dry dock, in which boats could be pulled up and repaired. In this trench was discovered the remnants of a richly ornamented rowlock, obviously Scandinavian in design. The most complicated system was constructed at a later date than the initial trench. It consisted of a system of wooden planks, over which boats could be pushed or pulled into or out of the water. Below the planks were mats of birch bark, serving as additional protection against the moisture. Proximate to Bestonka was a tar works, in the form of a meter-deep pit. It was round in shape with heated walls, and a smaller pit dug at the bottom, presumably to maintain a vessel for collecting the tar. Findings of dense, fatted charcoal at the bottom indicates that coniferous bark was burned in the tar production. Tar was, of course, an essential material for shipbuilding. It was painted onto the wooden hull to waterproof it. Bestonka was most likely not only used for repairing boats, but as a shipyard. In the Byzantine document, De Administrando Imperio, it is documented how the Rus traveling down to Kiev would have their boats constructed by the krivichi. These were a type of dugout canoe. Perhaps Gnezdovo was a shipyard for dugout production, or perhaps they were collected in the local area. There is also evidence of Scandinavian-style vessels being constructed at the Gnezdovo shipyard. Rope is an essential component of ship rigging, and during the period it was made from hemp. Pollen analysis reveals a rise in the cultivation of hemp during the heyday of Gnezdovo, indicating a local rope-making industry. There is evidence pointing to more complicated boats and dugouts being produced at the settlement. This is proven by the findings of boat rivets, including half-finished and broken ones. These rivets were not imported, but produced locally from a smithing area south of Bestonka, closer to the Dniepr. Though the area was designated as a smithing area, there was no permanent forge. Fireplaces were constructed one after the other at the same place, only to be covered up at the end of its lifespan and a new one constructed, resulting in the formation of a large, artificial hill. Nearby were found smithing tools and a great number of slags. Iron rivets were only used by Scandinavians for boat building. The Slavs made either dugouts or sewed the boats together. Evidence also points to the smithing area being used for storage, as there are findings of Byzantine amphora and beads, trade items which would require a temporary home. Quite a few findings from Gnezdovo indicate links to Byzantium. These include glazed pottery, amphora, glass vessels and ornaments, textiles, etc. Findings of Byzantine lead seals indicates the presence of diplomats or officials. These seals have been found at other important locations, like Holmgard and Kiev. Bestonka had been modified and improved into an excellent harbour. Its sister lake, the Kamisha, was used for industry instead. Water is an essential component for high-temperature metalworking, and easy access to the stuff made the industrial process much easier. However, manufacturing was distributed across the entire settlement. Some of it occurred in simple fireplaces, but most of it was centered around large workshops. At least 5 have been identified. The earliest workshop, dated to the first half of the 10th century, consisted of 2 chambers. The first room was 100 centimeters wide and 130 centimeters long. The second, 80 centimeters wide and at least 220 centimeters long. Inside were found 2 massive slags and fragments of a hearth. Judging by similar structures in medieval Norway, it is believed that the first chamber was the working area, and the second chamber was the place of the bellows or a storage for fluxes. The absence of crucibles indicate that only ironwork was done in this workshop. The two-chamber forge was replaced by a pit forge, similar in construction to other examples across northern Europe. It consisted of a cup-like pit, surrounded by a low clay wall, protecting the bellows from high temperatures. A nozzle was bored into the wall, for blowing oxygen into the furnace. In the second half of the 10th century, the workshop was centered around a big stone hearth, 2 meters in diameter. Beside it was a small, oval-shaped pit, presumably containing bellows on top of a platform. In this iteration of the workshop, we found numerous crucible shards, and tools including a goldsmith's hammer, a chisel, and a grindstone, indicating that the workshop was used for a diverse range of tasks. The ironworking of Gnezdovo bears a primarily Nordic character. The blacksmiths here engaged in multi-layer iron welding, a technique known in the Anglo-Scandinavian world and iconic to it during the Viking period. The ironworkers made weaponry, locks and keys, sewing needles, and high-quality knives. Jewelers were the most prestigious of the Gnezdovo craftsmen, and very often they operated in the manners of local nobility. Perhaps some of them were nobility themselves. They worked both with precious metals like silver and gold, but also base ones such as copper and lead. It also seems as if the craftsmen operated in separate districts based on the materials they worked with. The silver and coppersmiths lived and worked in the southeast. Jewelry could be produced in individual households, since all you really needed was a fireplace and a crucible. But findings of implements in Gnezdovo indicates that jewelcrafting was centered around the lake Kamishi. They used a variety of complicated tools and techniques, and worked both with raw materials and scrap or old products melted down. Byzantine and Arabic coins were a common form of currency in the settlement, and the jewelers would seemingly melt them down and make ornaments from them. As many as 13 coin hoards have been discovered in Gnezdovo, making it one of the richest settlements in the region. They produced jewelry for both men and women, and the craftsmen appear to have been multicultural, judging by many different findings. The presence of Scandinavian jewelers is evidenced by findings of clay molds, lead weights, and a few religious objects, a fire steel-shaped amulet and a lead idol. That is besides the Nordic jewelry, including women's fibula and items of culthood like Thor's hammer rings, pendants shaped like little shields, and belt mounts. But the crafting techniques of the Gnezdovo Norsemen differed slightly from their countrymen back west. Gnezdovo fibula had a lower proportion of zinc in their brass, implying repeated reprocessing. Brass loses a percentage of its zinc when smelted. There were not only Nordic jewelers working in Gnezdovo, but Baltic and Slavic ones also. Some of the Slavic jewelry appears West Slavic to be exact, indicating a Wendish presence. There might even have been Volga Bulgarians living in Gnezdovo, evidenced by findings of belt mounts originating from that part of the world. Or simply, it was a craftsman inspired by Turkic elements. Glass beads were a vital component of the eastern trade route ever since the turn of the 9th century. It appears as though Gnezdovo was an industrial center for the production of these beads. 5 different types of beads were identified. The most common type were made with metal foil, either from a drawn pipe or a twisting technique, quite sophisticated. The second type were made from molten glass, seemingly from the reprocessing of half-finished or broken glass. This type of bead was only made in non-integrated workshops. The third type of bead were presumably made in molds. The fourth type are called cross-striated beads, numerically small, but diverse in their composition. They were made by sequentially welding together lengths of glass rods into a plate, wrapping it around a tool, and butting the ends together. This complicated technique resembles Greek and Roman-era specimens from the northern Pontic. The fifth type were made with a central pipe made of copper or glass, presumably for acquiring a desired shape. This is a rare technique, also practiced in Central Europe. Pottery craft made up a huge part of the non-metallurgic industry. Ranging from large kitchen pots to smaller vessels, they were made on hand-driven wheels and often decorated with wavy lines, marking them as distinctively Western Slavic, same as the pottery found at Holmgard and other settlements in the region. Perhaps Gnezdovo was home to a decently sized Wendish population. Many of the pots are marked by the stamps of individual craftsmen, including circles, wheels, diamonds, and crosses. It seems that around 5 potters were active in Gnezdovo during its height, and they are clay products used by everyone in the town and vicinity. A lot of craftsmen also work with bone and horn, carving them into such items as combs. By the mid-10th century, the settlement had expanded from 4 hectares to a size of 15 hectares, suddenly becoming one of the largest in the region. It seems to have housed a population of between 800 to 1,000 inhabitants. Judging by findings from the cemetery, men, women, and children were represented in roughly equal shares. Animals included cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, and dogs. There seems to have been a ritual tradition of burying dogs and horses outside of a few houses, seemingly as a sort of protection against evil spells. It is believed that the Gnezdovo locals had a special relationship with horses. Findings in the settlement indicate that they were used for different purposes until they died, and they frequently appeared in burials, either in separate horse burials, together with a horseman, or as a sacrifice to an owner. Decorated horse bridles are a very common find. From the terraces of the Svinets riverbanks, the settlement expanded into the high grounds between the 2 lakes. The initial settlement was constructed in a disorganized manner, with the buildings disposed in an irregular pattern. The eastern part of the settlement was organized in a more structured manner. Land was divided into plots by the use of ditches and wooden fences. This form of urban planning has been discovered at Daugava, but also Scandinavian settlements like Ribe in Denmark and Kaupang, Norway. Though Slavic sites did have elements of estate housing, they do not have any boundary ditches, meaning that the urban planning involved in Gnezdovo's construction was Scandinavian. Regarding the actual houses, they remain largely a mystery. Most of the wooden remains have been claimed by the floods, making it hard to determine what architectural tradition the houses belong to. At other sites it is possible to determine this tradition based on the remnants of fireplaces. Balts, Norse and Slavs all constructed different ones, and the remnants of hearths have been identified at Gnezdovo. No satisfying conclusions have been drawn. 2 distinctive types of houses have been identified, one built entirely above ground, and one with a sunken floor. Both types can be identified within the settlement, but they serve different purposes: habitation, manufacturing, or economic. Remnants of the traditional Scandinavian longhouse are entirely absent. Some of these houses may have had glass windows, as indicated by findings of thin-walled glass, most likely a Byzantine import. It was not until the mid-10th century that a 12-meter-high hill overlooking Lake Gnezdovo was fortified into a hillfort. The first defensive works were made by fortifying the slope of the hill with a timber wall and a ditch, separating it from the settlement, perhaps an act of political segregation. The wall was seemingly burned down at the end of the century, and reconstructed shortly thereafter, perhaps as the result of societal upheaval, or simply a reconstruction effort. Several interesting artifacts have been discovered inside of the hill fort. They are small earthenware vessels, clearly Slavic in design. They are combs, necklaces, rings, a Byzantine coin, and a tortoise fibula iconic to Scandinavian women, indicating that a powerful Norse woman lived inside of the fort. Craft activities were not only relegated to the industrial district around Lake Kamisha, but distributed across the entire settlement, and even inside the hill fort itself. Craftsmen living inside of the hill fort indicates their possible influence in the local governance, or perhaps they were the most fortunate servant of whoever controlled it. The growth of the settlement led to a larger demand for agricultural produce. Satellite settlements began producing wheat and buckwheat for the plates of Gnezdovo. Cattle grazed the nearby grasslands, and hemp was grown for the production of rope. Expansion of agriculture can be proven by findings of iron plows for farming, and wooden plows used by draft animals. Though the area is quite forested in our day, the Viking Age climate was drier and suffered from a slight, albeit natural, deforestation. Gnezdovo was a place where people were born, lived, and died. Around the settlement grew large cemetaries. 5 smaller ones appeared outside of the main settlement, around the smaller one at the river Olsha and the southern bank of the Dniepr. The three largest ones appear in a sort of half circle on the northern side of the large settlement. According to modern estimates, the cemeteries contain at least 5,000 graves. However, only 1,500 have survived, the rest having been destroyed by posthumous construction, agriculture and even warfare, especially the Second World War. Almost all of the graves date from the mid-10th century, coinciding with the intensive development of the settlement during the same period. Most of the graves were cremations, meaning that the bodies and artifacts inside were often destroyed. This makes it hard to identify the ethnic composition of the cemetery, and thus the Gnezdovo settlement by proxy. Some have identified only 60 of the graves as specifically Nordic. Others say that no less than 25% of them are Scandinavian. Researchers admit that it's easier to identify female burials, since Scandinavian women can easily be identified by findings of their iconic oval brooches. Male graves are less ethnically defined. Out of the roughly 250 Scandinavian artifacts discovered at Gnezdovo, around 53 were brooches of this type. As a comparison, 50 brooches of this type were found at Norwegian Kaupang, and 316 at Swedish Birka. Historians estimate that Scandinavian migrants constituted no less than a quarter of the settlement's population. It must also be mentioned that Gnezdovo contains the most Scandinavian artifacts out of any Rus settlement, both in the cemeteries and the settlement itself. Assuming that the size of a mound reflects the social status of the deceased inside, the Norsemen must have made up a large fraction of the Gnezdovo elite. 6 of the largest barrows, more than 2.5 meters high, contain Scandinavian burials. Some of the bodies have been subject to genetic analysis, discovering that Gnezdovo had a prominent Swedish populace, as is to be expected, but also a significant Danish contingent. People from across Scandinavia would have been active in the region. Let's take a look at the burial methods used in Gnezdovo. Cremations comprise 52% of the investigated burials, the most common type being small barrows erected over cremation graves. The body was usually burned at the place of burial. The ashes of the body and their belongings were collected into urns, and the barrow dug of yellow clay and sand. Most of the mounds covered only a single burial, but sometimes double burials of a man and a woman, or a woman and a child. Many of the burials included sacrifices of horses and dogs. Nordic burials were quite extravagant, whereas the Slavic ones were more simple. Unfurnished cremations, or burial with just a handful of objects, usually knives, pottery, 1 or 2 arrowheads, or single beads. Eastern Slavic women were often buried with wire temple rings, a very common find. There is also evidence of Central European and Baltic Slavs in the form of Moravian jewelry, and of course, their iconic pottery. Most impressive are the large mounds, dedicated to prominent warriors and aristocrats. The largest one was 9 meters high, 33 meters in diameter, with a conical shape and surrounded by a 2-meter deep ditch. Several of them were made with stone, emblematic of Scandinavian burial practices. Slavic and Finnic ones used wood. The men inside of these burials were often cremated inside of a ship, as can be indicated by findings of boat rivets. Analysis of these rivets revealed that they're both of the square-shaped type from Middle Sweden, and the round sort from southern Scandinavia. This indicates that the burial boats at Gnezdovo could have been brought from back home, or constructed at the local shipyard, perhaps even specifically for the burial ceremony. They were buried together with important artifacts, like horse bridles, jewelry, gaming pieces, and dice. Approximately 13% of the graves harbor weaponry. 7% hold coins and/or scales and weights, tools of commerce. Buckets are also a common find in these prominent graves. Animal sacrifices include horses, birds, sheep, cows, and rams. In one of the mounds, a woman was found burnt together with her man. This was most likely not a slave girl, as described in the burial by Ahmad ibn Fadlan. Several artifacts indicate that she was prominent, most interesting being a drinking horn. These were a symbolic manifestation of the function of the woman as a wife, who during feasts was supposed to distribute drinks, according to the hierarchical order. Remnants of military equipment at Gnezdovo have allowed artists and archaeologists to reimagine what Rus and Viking warriors would have looked like. 2 of the helmets discovered are of the so-called Spangen type. These have also been found in Kiev and Norway. They are depicted on picture stones in Scandinavia, Gotland especially. One of the Spangen helmets discovered in Gnezdovo was not of Norse origin, however. The cylindrical top and mail guard suggests Oriental craftsmanship. Shields have also been found in the graves. These are about 1 meter in diameter, made of wooden planks painted red, rimmed with metal clamps, and fortified by an iron boss in the center. To provide the deceased with a pair of shields appears to have been an old custom, and has likewise been observed at Birka. Some of the swords have caused a bit of controversy. Owing to the inconsistent style of the hilts, some have argued that they were made by Scandinavians, by second-generation Scandinavian immigrants less familiar with the original style, or local Slavic craftsmen less familiar with the style also. Another one of the sword hilts has been identified as crafted by a master smith from Gotland. Gnezdovo also contains the largest concentration of Carolingian swords in Old Rus. The Franks were renowned swordsmiths, often working with Damascus steel imported by the Norsemen, and Ahmad ibn Fadlan described them as a weapon frequently wielded by the Rus. One of the oldest mounds has been identified as Scandinavian, holding both a man and a woman. Inside was found a Carolingian sword, Arab silver coins, carnelian and crystal beads, and a Byzantine pitcher, all evidence of the nobleman's far-flung travels or contacts. There's also an amphora, marked with one of the earliest pieces of evidence of Slavic written text. Some have interpreted it as gorushna, mustard, others as gurun, a Slavic name. The enigmatic pot makes it hard to identify the man in the grave. Was he a Slavic warrior named Gurun, married to a Scandinavian woman, or a Scandinavian warrior with a preference for mustard? Either way, it does attest to the multi-ethnic character of the settlement. Slavic rings are also an incredibly common find in the grave, often found together with Scandinavian artifacts. Men and women were not the only ones buried at Gnezdovo. In one of the cremations was discovered the body of a child. It was under 6 years old at the time of death, and was accompanied by an inventory including a Thor's hammer necklace and linings on its chest in the form of birds. The second most common form of burial was inhumation, constituting around 31% of all the burials. Firstly, a chamber pit was dug, perhaps fortified by wood and moss. The body was rested inside of the chamber in the finest clothes and jewelry, and surrounded by items of importance, weaponry, belongings, animals sacrificed. The chamber was roofed, and a mound erected over it. In a very typical example, a woman was buried under a mound in 979, wearing a silk shirt and a pair of oval brooches. She was buried together with a pottery vessel and a wooden cup with silver mounts. On the floor stood 3 large candles and 9 smaller ones. In one of the more unusual graves, in which another woman was buried, the roof of the chamber was topped by an urn containing the cremated remains of a child, items of bronze, and an unidentified animal. These burials occurred simultaneously. It has been speculated that the woman might have been a Christian, and the child died before baptism and had to be buried as a pagan. Rus was officially Christianized in 988, but traces of Christianity appeared in Gnezdovo earlier than at other sites in the region. Several artifacts from Gnezdovo indicate that they were early adopters of Christianity. Multiple graves contain wax candles which would have been lit during the burial ceremony. They wore crucifix-shaped pendants, and many of the graves were simple inhumations, typical of the Christian tradition. The body laid in a west-east orientation, some even buried in wooden coffins. The region wasn't converted until 1014, but the Christian objects in Gnezdovo appear around the middle or third quarter of the 10th century. This phenomenon does not occur elsewhere in the region. However, some have debated the idea that the Christian artifacts are indicative of conversion. Instead, they might simply have been items of status. It is also interesting that early Christian artifacts appear predominantly in female graves. This has been compared to Princess Olga of Rus, purportedly an early convert to the Christian faith. So what can we learn from the graves at Gnezdovo? The people here were a complicated, multi-ethnic network of Balts, local Krivichi Slavs, Western Slavs, and Scandinavians from Sweden, Gotland, Denmark, and more. At least 25% of the population was made up of Norsemen, and they constituted a large part of the ruling aristocracy. They did not only consist of itinerant mercenaries, they brought with them their wives and children, entire families, and they lived, died, and were born at Gnezdovo. Most of the people were pagans, but there were among them early adopters of Christianity. The importance of Gnezdovo as an industrial hub, vital for trade and ship repairs, led to unprecedented growth in the mid-10th century. I am under the impression that this often neglected settlement was key in the rise of Rus. It was located right in the middle of the great conglomerate, and the pivot around which it spun. It opened up a link between Ilmen and Kiev, and it wasn't until 930, at the height of Gnezdovo's importance, that outside sources described Kiev as the capital. I find it apt to speculate that the rise of Gnezdovo may have contributed to the foundation and maintaining of the state, stretching from Lake Ladoga to the Black Sea. How this unification occurred exactly is unknown. Commercial interests, alliances, and soft power would be my guess. Russian historians have often interpreted Gnezdovo as a pogost, a center for the Kievan state to collect tribute from the vassal tributaries in the hinterlands. Princess Olga had founded such a pogosti in the Dniepr, Desna, and Novgorod regions. The system of pogosti began to disappear at the turn of the 11th century in favor of fortified towns and castles dependent on agricultural settlements. As discussed previously in the video, the area surrounding Gnezdovo was not suitable for agriculture. It seems to have primarily been founded as a harbour and manufacturing centre, and though the industry remained strong at the turn of the century, it had by now been abandoned as an anchorage. The cities of Novgorod and Kiev were becoming more powerful and less interested in directing trade towards Scandinavia, which seems to have been a key interest with the powerful Norse population of Gnezdovo. Gnezdovo as a whole was abandoned procedurally but still rather quickly. Owing to the limits of the surrounding agriculture, it couldn't house an especially large population and had a marked development limit. If Gnezdovo was to remain a seat of its local elite, they had to move their power base. A similar process had occurred at Lake Ilmen. The fortified hill on Goradice was converted to a feudal estate, with a new and larger city called Novgorod constructed further up north. In the same vein, the city of Smolensk was constructed 12 kilometers east of Gnezdovo. Smolensk had a more defensible and strategic position, and the landscape more favorable for agriculture. The earliest evidence of a settlement at Smolensk dates to the second half of the 11th century. The name of the city appears earlier, leading most scholars to believe that the Gnezdovo settlement was the original Smolensk, and the name was simply moved over. The first wooden fortress was constructed at the turn of the 11th century. The first stone structure was built in 1101 by Prince Vladimir Monomach, a stone cathedral. It was blown up by Polish troops during the siege of Smolensk in 1611. When power was switched from Gnezdovo to Smolensk, the Scandinavians did not go with it. The appearance of Scandinavian artifacts disappear almost entirely from Gnezdovo in the 11th century. There are no signs of violence as far as I know. Perhaps they rapidly assimilated, but I find it likelier that they moved back home to Scandinavia or were perhaps even deported. Evidence of their disappearance can be found in local smithing. As mentioned previously, the Norse blacksmiths made use of multi-layered iron welding, a technique which never appeared in Smolensk in the 11th century and onwards. However, Gnezdovo did not disappear. It was transformed into a feudal estate, and in documents from the 14th century, it is mentioned as a residence of the service people near Smolensk. So it would continue to coexist with the largest city, but it would never more achieve its Viking Age prominence. Smolensk would grow into one of the strongest principalities of the medieval Rus. Gnezdovo and Smolensk are a very interesting case study in the development of medieval cities, and how they differed from earlier ones, which were primarily trading posts and craft centers, whereas the medieval town was self-sufficient and militarily defensive. If you enjoy the content I produce, do consider supporting me monetarily by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. You'll find all of the necessary links in the video description, where you will also find a list of all of the sources used in writing the video script. If you're hungry for more historical content, check out my catalogue of videos touching on Northern European history from the Neolithic to early modern period. Or maybe even sail across the sea and check out my secondary channel, Golden Gunpowder, which covers colonial piracy during the 17th century. Please enjoy, and I'll see you again soon.